Hi everyone, thanks for dropping by and for returning to the old world. Today, let's talk about the Empire, and are they a really good starting point for entry into the Warhammer element of the wargaming hobby? Short answer, yes, I think so, but with some caveats. We'll touch on that in a second. Firstly, what is the Empire? Now, we've talked about this in a previous video, looking at what the Empire might look like in Warhammer the Old World. But ultimately, the Empire is a collection of states ruled by an elected emperor, effectively the Holy Roman Emperor, ruling over the Holy Roman Empire. Now, within the Empire, internal strife and politics are really common, but what's really important is that the realm is human. Now, I say that the realm being human is important because it gives us a certain element of understanding where the characters in the game are coming from. Because as much as we might like to be, we're not Chaos Warriors, we're not elves, trolls, or ogres. I do say human realm, and you'll see from the miniatures in the backdrop of this video, the classic halfling hot pot, the Empire is not exclusively human, it is multicultural, which obviously gives some variety to our gameplay. And I do recall that back in the day when I first started playing Warhammer Fantasy, you could actually include dwarves in an Empire army to represent the population that had moved from the more traditional dwarf realms. But that is an aside. So, what are these caveats I mentioned? Well, obviously, there's no rules for Warhammer the Old World, so everything around this is just pure speculation. Now, we know that looking at historical games about fantasy, that humans are generally jack of all trades and master of none. So they will be reasonable at pretty much any game style, but who knows. The no rules thing also means that you might be building an army around a very specific idea, and that when the rules come out and the associated points costs for various units, that idea might be completely blown out of the water. I've suffered from this in 8th Ed myself, just by way of an example, where I was building an army around the concept of pike and shot, so lots of spearmen, lots of handgunners, and then, if memory serves, handgunners went up by, I think it was a point, which took a bang average unit into the realms of a unit that you just wouldn't touch with a barge pole because it was just so expensive. Now, that was a real shame, because it did mean that it kind of killed off my concept, because I didn't then have the points available to get in the unit that would give my army some stability if I wanted to continue with the approach I was taking. The other caveat is the aesthetics aren't known. We know that we should, in theory, be able to use our existing models, so it does give us, however, a good idea of what we can expect, so the kinds of models that we can hope to buy. So what are the advantages of the Empire? Well, I've mentioned that it's generally a human faction, so they're relatable. This is humans living in a dangerous world. And whilst we may not share our world with orcs and ogres, we know what it's like to be human, we know what it's like to be suffering from stress, from challenging situations, and as people, how we respond to that. Now, all people are different, obviously, but it gives us some insight as to how the minds of the people of the Empire might respond. Then there's the matter of variety. Now, there's a huge choice of models available on the market. Not just fantasy models, not just Games Workshop. There's loads of people that produce historical figures, and you'll see before you there's some stuff here from Fireforge Games. There's some models here which I believe were made by Reaver. And there's a huge variety of things that you can go out and buy. And historical figures can also be a lot more affordable than their fantasy counterparts. Indeed, a lot of historical miniatures available have also been made by people that have produced for Games Workshop in the past, such as Perry Miniatures, for example. What's another advantage of the Empire? Well, have I mentioned variety? By the time the 8th ed came around, the Empire had a huge roster and number of playing styles. Do you want to go heavy cavalry galore? Fantastic, go for it. Lots and lots of cheap infantry. Yep, that will work. Magic heavy, artillery train, a combination thereof. So many ways that you can play the Empire. It means you can collect one army, make a few tweaks, and try out loads of different playing styles and find the way that you like to play the game. Other factions don't really have those sort of opportunities. The dwarves, for example, traditionally lack spellcasters that are the usual sort of spellcasters, certainly in Warhammer, and certainly lack the mobility provided by light and heavy cavalry. Just by way of example. Any other reasons why you might want to start with the Empire? Well, fourthly, we are looking at variety again. So every state within the Empire is different. It has its own livery, its own personality, its own political setup. And this is true of all the different levels of politics within the Empire. Each local baron will have their own colours, they'll equip their own units, and there's nothing to say that your impoverished local baron won't be equipping his men in the same equipment that his grandfather did, or certainly stuff of the same style, where we're talking about cloth and things like that, which obviously won't have survived too well over the course of generations. But it does mean that it gives you a huge scope around the aesthetic. You can go with the sort of style we talked about in the previous video. We can go with something closer to the models being used at the end times. There is such a huge spectrum of stylistic choices that you can make. Or maybe your lord has got close ties to Estelia, and might be moving into something more closely akin to the Conquistador style models that were floating around in the Dogs of War sections. So the variety of colours, of models, and the choice this gives you for painting and collecting means I think there's so much scope with Empire. You can do so much with them that they shouldn't become dull to play with, because you can always just make tweaks and play them a very different way. And it will also give you a good understanding of the mechanics, hopefully again looking historically at how the game was played without tons and tons of special rules, which means that once you've found a playstyle, if you want to then go on to collect another army as a newer player or a returning player, then you've got a good concept and a good grasp of what you want to achieve. I have seen players start with armies like Skaven and struggle with the just massive special rules and quirky table after quirky table, dealing with a faction that just plays so differently from everything else. Now, that's great if you're an experienced wargamer. It's great if you love those models and you really want to play with them. But if you're trying to learn the game, I think something that's a bit steadier, that doesn't have tons of quirks but allows you to really explore the game, is a really, really good first option. Do you agree with what I'm saying? Have you got another faction in mind you think is a really good starting point? If so, do let me know in the comments. Otherwise, this is Return to the Old World. Have a great day.